All right, Greg is not here, so I'll just start. I'm Salil Vadhan, and I'm going to try to give you all an overview of this new project we have, a multidisciplinary project on privacy tools for sharing research data, which we've been developing here at CRCS in collaboration with a number of other institutes and parts of the university, which I'll talk about later, over the last couple of years with some seed funding from Google, and this year have been ramping up to full scale with a new grant from NSF. And the idea for the presentation today is to give you an overview of what we hope to accomplish in this project, some of the different threads of research and the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. And this way, maybe it can be an opening for collaboration with other things that you all are doing, other things going on at the university, or for some more of you to get involved with the project. OK, so by those who don't know me, I'm here in the computer science faculty, a theoretical computer scientist. I've among other things, I've worked on cryptography, and these days I'm doing a lot of work on theoretical algorithmic approaches to data privacy, a line of work on differential privacy, which I will talk about in some more detail later. OK, so the context for our project is the exciting transformation that's happening in social science due to the immense variety and volume of new sources of data that are now available on human behavior, such as cell phone GPS readings, internet web searches, political blog posts, social network activity. And so as a result of all these new sources of data, instead of being limited to surveys of a few thousand people, researchers can carry out studies on the scale of hundreds of thousands by using data from all of these sources. Moreover, the internet and data repositories such as the Dataverse network, which I'll talk about a little bit more later and plays an important role in our project, have made it much easier to share data like this and traditional sources of data as well with other researchers to enable replication and new analyses. However, a major obstacle to realizing the potential of this vision is privacy. Most of these data sets contain sensitive personal information about individuals, and currently social scientists do not have the tools to ensure that the privacy of those individuals is protected when the data is analyzed or shared. The result is that researchers are often, and increasingly so, refusing to share their data with other researchers for fear of privacy compromise. And so this results in a clash between privacy concerns on one hand and the big push that's happening both by funding agencies and the research community towards open sharing of data. So what to do about this? The traditional approach is to try and anonymize data before sharing it with others by stripping what's called personally identifying information, removing obvious identifiers from the data. However, it is now well known that this technique does not work because even moderate amounts of seemingly innocuous data, the data that's left in the data set after you remove obvious identifiers, is usually enough to uniquely isolate individuals. And this information can often be linked with other publicly available data sets to re-identify the individuals in supposedly anonymized data sets. This problem was demonstrated dramatically in work by one of the PIs on the project, LaTanya Sweeney, a while ago when she linked anonymized medical claims data that had been released in the state of Massachusetts with publicly available voter registration rolls to uniquely identify the record of then Governor William Weld at the time. So this was one of the earliest and most high-profile re-identifications of supposedly anonymized data. And since then, there have been numerous other examples. People may have heard of the re-identification in the Netflix challenge, of when AOL tried to share its web search logs with researchers, and we just hear more and more cases of this. And the difficulty is that we don't really have this traditional approach doesn't really offer room for a better solution. And what it does is it presents a very stark choice between privacy on one hand and the utility of the data on the other. So if you only remove obvious identifiers from the data, then the privacy that you can provide is very weak. And that's why all of these re-identifications occur. You've only made it slightly harder to identify the individuals in the data set. And if you aggressively aggressively try to anonymize the data, then you may be left with very little data utility. You may be forced to remove the very information that you're trying to study. All right, so the goal of the project in sort of cartoon form here is to help relieve these tensions, to try and enable both privacy and open sharing of data, and to try and push this utility versus privacy curve out as much as possible so that we can simultaneously have a large amount of both. And the idea is to achieve this through the combined effort of a bunch of different disciplines. From computer science, we will draw upon a recent and flourishing body of work that has illuminated our conception of data privacy through strong new protection models, such as differential privacy, which I'll talk about in a little more detail later. And it's provided algorithms that achieve strong privacy guarantees while still minimally distorting data, or the results of queries on data. And then to understand whether these methods coming from computer science are useful in practice, we need to understand the needs of the social scientists and statisticians who are actually studying the data, and to understand their constraints and how they work with data, and the kind of type of data they're working with, and the quality of results they need. And finally, the technological solutions coming from computer science and statistics need to be developed in tandem with appropriate legal and policy instruments that guide and support researchers and IRBs who govern the work of researchers as they handle privacy-sensitive data. So this project came out of the collaboration of a bunch of different institutes here at Harvard. CRCS, I assume everyone being here knows what CRCS is about, and tries to foster new computer science research aimed at problems of importance to society. On the CRCS side, the PIs are myself and, just in time, Steve Chong, who just sat down. Steve works, for those who don't know, on programming languages approaches to security, and his work plays an important role in the project, both in ensuring that the algorithms we developed have really secure implementations, and also in developing formal languages for describing and enforcing privacy policies on privacy-sensitive data. And I'll talk a little bit about that direction of work later in the talk. Then we have the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, which develops and disseminates statistical, computational, and analytic tools for the social sciences to enable the kind of transformation that I talked about on the previous slide. And from IQSS, we have Gary King, a university professor based in the government department, who is the founder and director of IQSS, and Merce Crosas, who's the director of product development at IQSS, and led the design and development of the Dataverse network project software, which I'll be mentioning later in the talk. LaTanya Sweeney, I mentioned some of her early work on data privacy earlier. She was one of the first computer scientists to look at these kinds of data privacy issues. She founded and directed the Data Privacy Lab at Carnegie Mellon a number of years ago, and recently moved it. Now the Data Privacy Lab and LaTanya are based at IQSS and in the government department here. And then another important collaborator on this project and other efforts of CRCS related to privacy is the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, just next door. And Phil Malone, who is one of the faculty directors at the Berkman Center and is the director of the Cyber Law Clinic, is heading up our efforts on the legal side of the project, and I'll talk a little bit more about the role of the Cyber Law Clinic in the project later. Okay, and then from statistics, we have Edo Aroldi, who has worked both on computational social science from a statistics point of view, and as well as statistical approaches to data privacy. So fits in several aspects of the project. And then we have a number of other collaborators whom we're excited to be working with. Kobi Nissim, who's here at Circus as a visiting scholar this year. We're very happy to be working with him on data privacy issues, some of which are related to the project. Cynthia Dwork at Microsoft Research Silicon Valley. Kobi and Cynthia are two of the founders of the line of work on differential privacy. And Micah Altman, who is Director of Research at MIT Libraries, is a social scientist who's been working with us for a number of years. Okay, so there's a few different, if we're trying to categorize the work we're doing in the project, there are a number of different elements to it, ranging from definitional and experimental work with measures of privacy and data utility, to the development of both theoretical and practical technological and legal tools for handling privacy-sensitive data. And also efforts on the education and outreach side, making these tools and other educational materials on privacy available for public use and use by researchers who are handling privacy-sensitive data. So I'll talk about some of these parts of our project in more detail later, but first want to highlight a unique opportunity in the project that comes from this IQSS Dataverse Network project that I mentioned earlier. So what is the Dataverse Network project? It's open source software developed by IQSS for data sharing, preservation, citation, and analysis. And it is used to host virtual archives, so repositories of research data sets around the world. And the instance of it that's hosted at IQSS is the largest repository of social science data sets in the world, with 52,000 studies and 700,000 files ranging over a wide variety of disciplines, both within social science and outside. And what this Dataverse Network project gives us for what we're trying to achieve is a real opportunity to get the tools we develop in the research here used in practice by social scientists. We can test our methods on real data sets, such as the ones in the IQSS Dataverse. And we can integrate the tools with a software infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit more about how this works later, provided by the Dataverse Network that's already in wide use in social science and other disciplines. And even though social science is the first and main focus of our project, we hope that a lot of the tools we develop will be useful in contexts outside social science. So for example, in dealing with health data, medical data, where there's obviously a lot of privacy issues, and also in privacy contexts outside of research data. In electronic commerce, of course, there are a lot of privacy issues as well. Okay, so now I want to dig in a little bit to some of these aspects of the work, starting with the work on defining and measuring privacy. This has a variety of components: mathematical, legal, statistical, and experimental. And just want to mention a couple of those components here. So one significant aspect of our work is to try and bridge the gap between mathematical notions of privacy, like are being developed in the computer science and recent computer science literature, such as differential privacy, and legal conceptions of privacy, such as exist in regulation and scholarly legal writing on privacy. It's the perfect time to be doing this, as regulators are finally realizing that existing data privacy regulation is obsolete and needs major revision. In particular, the Department of Health and Human Services a couple of years ago started a process to revise the Common Rule, which is the piece of federal regulation that governs all research with human subjects. And one of the goals in their revision of the Common Rule is to better guide researchers and IRBs, institutional review boards, that govern, that are supposed to kind of ensure that researchers are not exposing their subjects to undue harm. One of the goals of in their major goals in their revision is to better equip them to deal with data privacy issues. And our group submitted extensive comments on the first phase, this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking for the revision of the Common Rule. And we plan to remain actively engaged in the process. And the goal is to make sure policymakers understand relevant insights from computer science and statistics, and conversely, that the values that are implicit in privacy regulation are also reflected in the kind of computer science, the work that computer scientists are doing on this problem. So one specific point that we really emphasized in our initial comments is that existing privacy regulation, not just the Common Rule, really many different privacy regulations that are out there in HIPAA, in the various regulations that govern how different government agencies handle data, the handling of student data, like in FERPA. All have an overly narrow conception of what is data. And this constrains the very way in which they can talk about privacy. So the conception of data implicit in all of these regulations is really what is sometimes termed microdata. That is, all data is a collection of person-specific records. Okay, so you can point and say, even if your name is not there, this is Salil's data, this is Steve's data, this is Eling's data, and so on in the data set. And we, of course, know from computer science that data need not be in this form. Even if you start with data in this form, after you compute on it and do other transformations on it and summarize it in some way, the data that you get out is no longer in this microdata form. Okay? And when you think about data only in microdata form, it tends to lead you to this traditional way of thinking about privacy. That the only way, if you assume that you start with data in this form and you end with data in this form, then the only way you can think about privacy is by stripping identifiers. It's hard to imagine any other way of thinking about privacy. And so as a result, a variety of techniques that are being developed in computer science and statistics for providing privacy are just there's a type mismatch with the regulation. You can't even really ask the question of whether they fit the regulation or not, because they're talking completely different kind of language. Okay, so this is the kind of a type of point that we hope to be able to make by kind of trying to bring the computer science understanding of privacy together with how people are thinking about privacy from a law and policy side. Okay, so in addition to this aspect of the work, there's also going to be work led by Latanya and Edo on estimating privacy risk. So developing new statistical and experimental methods to kind of estimate how much risk there is in a data set, even ones that are anonymized using the sort of traditional kind of, this actually primarily applies to ones that are anonymized using the more traditional approaches. And that is, estimate, given some models of data sets that exist in the world, public data sets that might be publicly available in the future, various kinds of population models. What is the likelihood that individuals in a given data set can be identified? How uniquely can they be identified? What kind of information about them can be extracted? And one can also carry out a similar sort of statistical analysis, try to carry out a similar statistical analysis for understanding even things that don't fit in this traditional framework, but for example, algorithms of differential privacy trying to come up with statistical estimates of how much actual risk there is. So I view this part of the work as kind of analogous to the role that cryptanalysis plays in cryptography. They measure resilience to certain kinds of attacks, ones that have been successful in the past, and provide upper bounds on the level of privacy that's achieved. And it's kind of complementary to the approach of differential privacy, which I'll talk about shortly, which I know, I keep promising it will come eventually, which provides worst-case guarantees of privacy on all data sets, on all kinds of attacks, but can potentially be overly pessimistic in trying to achieve this privacy-utility trade-off. Please feel free to stop me if anyone has any questions about any of the things that I'm talking about. OK, so now talk a little bit on the kind of algorithmic side. So the sort of design, testing, and implementation of algorithms for analyzing and sharing data in a privacy-protective manner. One promising direction here is the development of a differentially private version of Zelig, which is a unified framework for statistical estimation, which integrates already with the Dataverse network software. And I will drill on the next few slides, drill down on that a bit more. The goal, both with this and other algorithms that we develop, is for those that perform well in our experimental evaluations and seem to have promise in practice, is to eventually produce secure implementations that in the Dataverse network software that can be immediately integrated with software that people are already using to share and analyze data sets. And the goal here, I want to stress, sometimes people hear about this project, they worry that researchers are not going to kind of let you use these tools to cut off their access to data. Researchers need to work with data in their original raw format. You're going to get resistance from researchers for this. And I think really the way we think about what we're trying to do here is enable wider access to privacy-sensitive data. So enable access where previously or currently access would not be available due to privacy concerns. Right, so this is not as a replacement for the current mechanisms that are in place for sharing privacy-sensitive data, though we probably will offer some tools and suggestions for augmenting those traditional methods, which are typically that if you have a privacy-sensitive, if you want access to a privacy-sensitive data set, you'll need to jump through all sorts of hoops, go through an IRB, and get explicit approval to get your hands on the privacy-sensitive data. So that avenue will still be there, and the idea is to add a new access mechanism, which maybe can be made available for the public to have access to the data, and that one can use this public access mechanism to perform preliminary analyses, for example, to determine whether it's worth going through the hoops to try and get your hands on the raw data. OK, so now let me say a little bit more about trying to get a little bit more technical and on the point out some of the sort of computer science kind of research issues that come up here. So I've made reference to this concept of differential privacy, which has been developing in a line of work over the past decade. And what differential privacy is a strong privacy notion for computing on sensitive data sets. Right? What it does is it captures the idea of privacy being that no individual's data should have a significant influence on the output of a computation. Okay, formally, what that means is that if you take an individual, we talk in differential privacy, like in cryptography, we talk about algorithms that are randomized, that toss their own coins. And what differential privacy requires is that if you remove an individual's data from the data set or change it arbitrarily, the output distribution of the computation does not change much. right? And so in that sense, the individual's privacy is protected. What an adversary sees by interacting with this mechanism from seeing its outputs is no different than if your data wasn't present in the data set. Right? And somehow this concept allows one to achieve this balance between, on the one hand, being able to compute useful global statistics and do other global computations on the data while having it at the same time as protecting local individual level data. Okay, and there's been, as I said, I mentioned a decade of work that's really kind of been flourishing over the past decade, and many different differentially private algorithms have been developed for a wide variety of useful kinds of computations. And those who are interested, I'm teaching a graduate course this term upstairs, Tuesdays and Thursdays, about differential privacy if you're interested in learning more about the mathematics of it. All right, that's differential privacy. What's Zelig? Zelig was developed by Gary King, as I mentioned, is one of the PIs on the project, and others, as an easier to use framework for statistical estimations, for social scientists and others to use for statistical estimation. It's a package in the statistical, in Stata and R, these statistical programming languages. And it kind of provides a unified framework for a wide variety of statistical estimation methods that people use. Okay, and what's good about kind of trying to do differentially private Zelig? Well, it turns out, and it was a very nice coincidence when we realized this, that Zelig, the kind of the framework of Zelig fits extremely well with existing results in the differential privacy literature. And in particular, there are theoretical results that say, in principle, most of the methods in Zelig can be made differentially private in a rather automatic way. Okay, there's some kind of wrapper that you can put around essentially any statistical estimation method subject to some, a few important but natural conditions that will, in principle, maintain the convergence properties of the statistical estimation algorithm. So the loss, all right, so utility not going to zero, loss of utility going to zero. As the data set gets larger and larger. So as n goes to infinity, the convergence properties of the private versions of the statistical estimation are as good as the non-private versions of the statistical estimation algorithms. And second, this really works in a very modular way and basically would allow one, in principle, to take Zelig and at once create a sort of differentially private version of Zelig as a whole that you would interact with in a very similar way to the way people do now. Okay, so in a little more detail, or again, cartoon form, I'll actually show some screenshots that give. All right, so right now we think of, all right, so the Dataverse has a bunch of different data sets in it, and Zelig is this kind of this interface that you can use for carrying out various kinds of statistical estimation algorithms, regressions, and so on. And what it looks like is this. There's a nice web interface for it. In the Dataverse network software, you click on Advanced Statistical Analysis. You select the kind of analysis you want to do. So here you're doing logistic regression for binary dependent variables. Okay, and you select the variables in your data set that you want to analyze. So here, sex is picked as a dependent variable, and then you can select some explanatory variables. So you're trying to predict sex in terms of other variables, and then you just click Run Model, and you get some results out. This is how Zelig works now. It runs a logistic regression algorithm with your selection of variables on your selected data set, which in this case is this private economy, labor, quality, and underlying matrices. Okay, so this is how Zelig works, but the problem is you can't do it for all data sets. So here in the Murray Research Archive, which uses the Dataverse network software, you see what happens when you have a privacy-sensitive data set. You just have these data sets where their access is currently restricted. If you click on it, you'll get the schema and some background on the data, but there'll be some instructions about, well, if you want access to this data set, who you need to contact, what forms you need to fill out, and so on, what hoops you need to jump through. OK, so we have these data sets that are restricted due to privacy concerns. And then the idea of what we would like to do, if everything works out well, is put an interface here, this private Zelig interface that wraps around Zelig and says now we can enable the same kind of analyses, not just to be done on the data sets that weren't privacy sensitive, but on some of the privacy sensitive ones as well. And I guess one is kept red here because maybe there's some data sets that are so sensitive that you wouldn't even want to make them accessible through a privacy interface. Yep. All right, so John may be able to answer the question more. There are some, so the theoretical results do have some niceness conditions that need to be placed on the statistical estimation algorithm for the convergence properties to be provided, to be preserved. If I recall correctly, you'll get something private out no matter what, but the results that tell you you'll still get something useful out asymptotically require that your statistical estimation has to satisfy some niceness conditions. Is that right, John? OK. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of challenges along those lines. OK, and so the idea would you have the same kind of interface, but now there would be, all right, that's John Ullman over there, who is a grad student who's doing a lot of, leading a lot of this aspect of the work on the project, as well as a lot of the work on differential privacy, along with a number of undergrads who have been working on the implementation. Is Abiola here? All right, one of the undergrads. Abiola is one of the undergrads who's been working on the implementation experimentation. All right, so the idea is that it would be the same kind of interface, but there would be a private version of logistic regression and other analyses. All right, and you'd get your results out. There would be at least one extra parameter which governs how much the privacy is being provided, which wouldn't be necessarily something that the user can set. The user can't say by setting a parameter that I want to compromise privacy. That would be dependent on the level of sensitivity of the data set. It would be a decision made presumably by the researcher who deposits the data set, or automatically by the Dataverse network. And other than extra parameter, you more or less should get results back in the same format as you would from Zelig. That's the vision. All right, what are the challenges? All right, so one is that these theoretical results are asymptotic. They say as n, the size of your data set goes to infinity, the statistical estimation works as well as the non-private one. But the question is, how big does n really need to be before you start getting useful results? And can you get useful results for any n's that actually occur in data sets that people want to study? All right. And so we have some preliminary experimental results that are somewhat encouraging, but there's still a long way to go between kind of what we have so far and actually having something that's really useful in practice. And getting something that's actually useful may require having new algorithms. It may not just be tweaking the existing algorithms. And it may require doing something that's not quite as general as what I described, but for specific analyses of interest, delving into them and optimizing the performance for them. Another challenge is, how does one interpret the results? So differential privacy, as you probably got the sense from what I've said so far, does not give you exactly the same results as it's a kind of a randomized, noisy version of whatever computation the non-private computation you're trying to emulate. And from a statistical point of view, how do you incorporate that additional noise of differential privacy into the interpretation of your results at the end? What's the right way of thinking about that, understanding that, and presenting it, the end results to a user that takes that into account. And then finally, differential privacy has this concept of a privacy budget, okay, that every time you run a differentially private computation, the result of that computation leaks out a little bit of privacy. Okay? And of course, the nice thing is that you can make that as small as you want by controlling some parameter, which is usually called epsilon in differential privacy. But if you make this a public interface that people can keep asking queries, eventually that privacy budget degrades too much. And too much privacy has been lost, and either you need to add so much noise to your results that they're not useful anymore, or just shut off the system. Right? And so what's the right way to manage the privacy budget? All right? Are there ways of, can you do things like think of different users as non-colluding? Or what can you do to enforce sort of that you have non-colluding users so that you could have maybe some separate privacy budgets? All right? It's very tricky to think about how to do this in a safe way. So this is another thing we are thinking about. One dream that isn't as far-fetched as it might sound is to do a one-shot differentially private computation. Once and for all, compute some kind of differentially private summary of the data set that you do once and for all, and you use this summary to answer all future queries. Okay. All right, so for example, can we produce a summary that allows you to answer accurately answer any what's called multivariate marginal query? Okay, so let's say I want to ask queries of the type, what fraction of records in the data set, people in the data set, smoke and are over 35 and don't have cancer, or any query of that type, which is a conjunction of attributes. Okay, so I want to be able to answer any marginal query I like to within some given amount of accuracy, say to within plus or minus 1/100th of the number of records in the data set, and do this with differential privacy. Okay, so I want to produce a single summary that allows me to answer any of these. Turns out there's a beautiful, really surprising result of Blum, Liggett, and Roth in differential privacy that says that actually you can produce summaries like this that allow you to answer simultaneously allow you to get accurate answers to all of these exponentially many marginal queries. Because exponentially many, meaning exponential in the number of attributes, because you have a choice of any subset of attributes to include. And moreover, the summary that they produce is a very easy to use one. It's just a synthetic data set. It's something that looks like a data set, but has the property that all of these marginal statistics, multivariate marginals, are approximately the same as in the original data set. And yet, somehow, through some fancy randomization that's happening in the algorithm, no individual's data in the original data set has a significant influence on the synthetic data set you see, on the distribution of synthetic data sets that you get out. It's a really remarkable result. But the problem with this result of Blum, Liggett, and Roth is that it's computationally very inefficient. It requires a computation that's exponential in the dimensionality of the data that you're starting with, and so is only feasible for fairly low dimensional data. Unfortunately, so this is inherent for producing differentially private synthetic data. This is work done with John a couple of years ago. We showed that kind of making their algorithm efficient is as hard as breaking all of modern cryptography. So it's not something we don't expect to be able to get a computationally efficient version of their result. But you can do other things. And again, we have some promising initial results along these lines that maybe your summary doesn't need to be in this nice form of a synthetic data set. You produce some other more complicated kind of summary that still allows you to answer all the same questions. And as a kind of in work with John and Justin Thaler, who's another graduate student here, we've managed to get the running time down to what is sometimes called sub-exponential, exponential and square root of the dimensionality of the data, rather than exponential in the dimensionality of the data. And John and others have even further progress along these lines. And the algorithms are actually not too complicated. And so there's some hope that maybe one can do this sort of one-shot differentially private computation feasibly on more data sets than was possible before. Let's see how I'm doing on time. All right. All right, and then finally, so kind of moving back up a level, this was kind of, I wanted to drill into some of the algorithmic and computer science aspects of the project since this is the Circus seminar. The work on all these computational tools is also going to be accompanied by trying to develop an array of legal instruments to assist researchers in handling privacy-sensitive data. And here we're really imagining things that will work through the full research pipeline, from when researchers get consent from their data subjects, what exactly should be the nature of the consent that they get, to the terms under which they share the data with other researchers, either directly or through the kinds of computational tools that I was talking about. And this part of the project, as I mentioned, will be led by Phil, who's Malone is sitting up here. And he'll be working with the Berkman Center Cyber Law Clinic, which is in the clinic, Harvard Law students get to work on real-world privacy problems. And the Cyber Law Clinic has extensive experience in working on issues like this. So they've worked on dealing with on cases from researchers dealing with privacy-sensitive data in the past, compliance with security and data privacy laws, drafting privacy policies, developing licenses and other sorts of legal instruments to protect sensitive data. And so this is one of the nicest places where our project integrates well with education, because this is at the same time something that's contributing very directly to the end outcomes of our research project, and is also providing this great educational experience for law students. Another thing which sort of fits maybe in the legal instruments side of the project is the idea of developing kind of a Creative Commons style set of privacy tags for specifying both the level of sensitivity and the terms of use for privacy-sensitive data sets. Okay, so trying to come up with some classification of the main ways in which we might deal with privacy concerns in a data set. And ideally, this would be something that can be enforced. There'll be a formal specification of what these tags mean, and it can be automatically enforced using programming languages techniques. Okay, so what are these kind of privacy tags? This is just a slide from some initial work on it. So the idea here might be, on one axis, you have a categorization of the data set in terms of how sensitive is the data. Right? And so don't pay too much attention to the specific terminology here, but Harvard's research data security policy has 5 levels of sensitivity, which correspond to things from the data is completely innocuous, there's nothing to worry about even if this were made entirely public, to data sets where there is, if this data, for example, researchers doing interviews with gang members, where the data, if it were made public, could have criminal risks associated with it, or risks to people's lives, harm, physical injury or other harm. So that's one axis that would come in, and another axis would come in would be the level of protection that you might be providing on the data set. So this is kind of thinking in terms of the sort of traditional approaches to anonymization, but one could put in here, differentially private access as another. You have another access which is the sort of policy or privacy regulation that applies, or the type of consent. So maybe you have explicit consent for complete sharing. Open consent is one approach that people are taking to dealing with privacy-sensitive data. Maybe you are dealing with data sets under HIPAA, where there are two different privacy provisions. And so the idea would be to place any given data set or understand what the options for sharing a data set are within a big multidimensional matrix like this. OK. All right, so on the education side, I've already talked about how the Cyber Law Clinic plays a major role in our work. And I've talked about my graduate course on privacy this term. There's a number of others, privacy-related courses taught by people involved with the project and integrate with our research in a variety of ways, including course projects. We envision projects in courses such as CS 105 in my grad course. A number of them will be inspired by or related to work we're doing in the project. And then another aspect of outreach, a major goal we have, is to generate a wide array of open resources for social science researchers, privacy practitioners, and anyone wishing to make better informed decisions about privacy. So in addition to enabling access to more privacy-sensitive data in the Dataverse network, as I talked about earlier, we also want to try to make our computational and legal tools available as kind of standalone open resources, which can be used by other researchers, both within and outside social science. And kind of the idea is that a researcher confronted with a data privacy problem, a data set they want to share, can kind of choose from the variety of algorithms, legal instruments, best practices, kind of like ordering from a restaurant menu, right? That you have this kind of menu of resources and some guidance for how one should select the appropriate tool for a given context. Okay. So that's one other sort of outreach outcome that we hope to have. And I should mention Adam. Adam is here. Adam Tanner is writing. He's a Reuters reporter in residence at the Data Privacy Lab and writing articles to make the general public aware of all kinds of data privacy issues, both related to the project and ones outside the scope of the project as well. OK, so I've already talked about a number of the different kinds of outcomes we're looking for in the project. And maybe it's just good to wrap up with saying a bit about how you can get involved if you're interested. The website for the project is up there, privacytools.cs. If you're interested in getting involved, you can email one of us, one of the PIs, or this general Privacy Tools Info email address. We have an all-hands meeting for the project once a month, second Friday of each month, usually in this room, where we talk about progress on different aspects of the project. And we're looking for people to work on the project of kind of variety of different types, ranging from undergraduates to graduate students, technical graduate students, students on the law side, and so on. In particular, I think there's a call out right now that you can find on our link from the project website for a research fellow on the legal side of the project. We also have a call out for our summer research program as part of the C's REU program. So if you know anyone who might be a good fit for that, encourage them to apply. And also, in addition to people working directly on the project, we're interested in collaborators. In particular, if you have a data privacy problem for which the kinds of things we're working on may be relevant, or maybe even if not, we're interested to hear about it and either give you pointers or maybe collaborate on it. That's all I have to say. I think we are, because of the change in room, we're a little constrained on time, but I have time after this. I'm happy to chat with people outside. We have a few minutes if anyone has any questions.